The gun was already in Alfred Morgan's hand when Julia Yates asked him the question that had been burning in her chest for 3 long years. "Did you know?" she said. Her voice did not shake. She had promised herself it would not shake. "Did you know what my father was before you came to Redemption Creek? Before you looked me in the eye and told me you were just a drifter passing through?" The saloon had gone silent. Every man in the room had stopped breathing. The kerosene lamps swayed on their hooks as a desert wind found the gaps in the clapboard walls, and the light made shadows lunge across Alfred Morgan's face like something dark and unnameable was fighting to get out of him. He set the gun down on the bar. That deliberate, careful motion was somehow more frightening than if he had raised it. "Some questions," Alfred said slowly, "take a long time to deserve an answer." And then he answered every one. But to understand what he said, you have to understand where they came from. You have to go back to the summer of 1878, to the town of Redemption Creek, Texas, which was the kind of place that sounded like salvation when you first heard the name and felt like a punishment once you arrived. You have to understand what Julia Yates was before that summer changed her completely, and what Alfred Morgan was carrying when he rode into town on a horse that was too good for him, wearing boots that were too worn for the horse, and looking at everything in Redemption Creek with eyes that were measuring the distance to every exit. Redemption Creek sat at the bottom of a shallow valley carved by a river that had mostly given up on itself. The river still ran in spring, brown and grudging, but by August it was a damp suggestion between two clay banks. The town had grown up along the old cattle trail and stayed when the trail shifted, the way towns sometimes do, too stubborn or too tired to move. There was a general store owned by a man named Hartwell Briggs who watered his flour and shorted his weights. There was a livery stable, a church with a cracked bell, a barber who also pulled teeth, and the Silver Meridian Saloon, which was the only establishment in Redemption Creek that made any honest profit. Julia Yates had lived in Redemption Creek her entire 24 years of life. She was the daughter of Clarence Yates, who was the town's land agent, and who everyone in the county believed to be an upstanding man of business. Clarence Yates wore good suits and quoted scripture and shook your hand with both of his, which is the particular gesture of a man who wants you to believe he has nothing hidden behind his back. Julia had her mother's dark brown hair and her father's sharp mind, which was a combination that had served her well in some ways and poorly in others. She managed the books for her father's land office, because Clarence Yates trusted no one with numbers except his own blood, and because Julia was better with numbers than anyone else in the county, including men twice her age who had been educated back east. She kept meticulous ledgers, and she was very good at not looking too closely at what those ledgers sometimes implied. That was her dark secret, and she had been living with it for 3 years by the time Alfred Morgan arrived. The first time she saw him, it was a Tuesday in late June, and the heat was already murderous by 9 in the morning. He came through the door of the land office with his hat in his hand, which was a courtesy most men in Redemption Creek had forgotten. He was tall but not ostentatiously so, with the kind of lean, careful build that suggested he had been genuinely hungry at some point in his life and had not entirely forgotten it. His face was weathered, brown from sun, with a jaw that looked like it had made up its mind about something. His eyes were a particular shade of gray that Julia would spend a great deal of time later trying to describe to herself and failing. He said he was looking for land. She said the office opened at 8 and closed at 5 and she could show him what was available. He said that would be fine. His name, he told her, was Alfred Morgan, and he was from Missouri, and he had been traveling for about 6 weeks, and he was looking for something with water access if possible. Julia showed him the survey maps and the parcels that were listed. She was professional. She was precise. She did not let herself look at his hands, which were the kind of hands that told a story if you knew how to read them, calloused in particular places, with a steadiness that was not the steadiness of a man who had spent 6 weeks merely traveling. Alfred Morgan asked careful questions. He asked about water rights and about the neighboring landowners, and about the history of the surveying in the eastern parcel lots. The questions were more sophisticated than a simple drifter would ask. Julia noted this without commenting on it. "You've looked at land records before," she said. "Some," Alfred said. "Where?" He met her eyes then, and there was something in his expression that was not evasion exactly, but was the cousin of evasion. "Here and there," he said. Julia Yates had been raised by Clarence Yates, which meant she had an extremely refined sensitivity to the particular way men deflected questions they did not want to answer. She filed Alfred Morgan's deflection away in a mental ledger as carefully as she filed anything else. He came back the next day, and the day after that. He was not buying land, she began to understand. He was looking at records. He was looking at the history of land transfers in the county going back about 4 years, which she provided because she had no legal reason not to, and because the way he asked for things made her want to help him even when a more cautious version of herself was whispering that perhaps she should not. On the 4th day, he asked if she would have supper with him. Julia said no. On the 5th day, he brought her a piece of apple pie from the bakery on Front Street, wrapped in a cloth napkin, and set it on the corner of her desk without comment and looked at the survey maps. She ate the pie. She did not say anything about it. On the 6th day, she said yes to supper. She told herself it was because she was 24 years old and had been engaged once, to a man named Robert Cleet who had died of fever 2 years ago, and she was not going to be the kind of woman who turned down every opportunity that arrived at her door. She told herself it was because Alfred Morgan was interesting, which was something she could not say about most of the men in Redemption Creek. She did not tell herself the thing that was actually true, which was that she had started to look for him every morning at the land office door before she even opened the shutters on the windows, and that when he arrived, something in her chest loosened slightly, like a knot that had been there so long she had mistaken it for part of her structure. They ate supper at the boarding house, which was the only establishment that served meals to unmarried women and men together in a way that the town could tolerate. Mrs. Kavanaugh, who ran the boarding house and had opinions about everything, seated them at a table near the window where she could observe them from the kitchen doorway. Alfred did not seem to notice or care about Mrs. Kavanaugh's surveillance. Julia found this refreshing. He ordered roast beef and she ordered the same, and they talked about the land records he had been studying, and he was careful again, redirecting when she pushed, but she was also careful, and they circled each other with the particular wariness of two people who are very attracted to one another and also have things to hide. "What is it you're really looking for?" Julia asked, cutting her beef. "I told you," Alfred said. "Land. You've looked at records going back to 1874, she said. "Nobody who is just buying land needs to go back 4 years. Alfred was quiet for a moment. He had a way of being quiet that was not uncomfortable, that had a kind of density to it, like he was actually using the silence to think rather than to evade. "There were some land transfers in 1874 and 1875 in this county," he said finally, "that I have reason to believe were not entirely legitimate." Julia set down her fork. She kept her face very still. She was good at that. "What kind of reason?" she said. "The legal kind," Alfred said, and there it was. She had suspected something, but hearing it stated, even obliquely, was a different thing. Because if Alfred Morgan was looking at those land records for legal reasons, then he was either a lawyer or a government man or a bounty officer, and any of those things meant he was looking at records that touched, eventually, on the business of Clarence Yates. "I see," Julia said. "Do you?" Alfred said, and he looked at her with those gray eyes, and she had the sudden cold conviction that he knew exactly who she was and whose daughter she was, and had known since before he walked into the land office on that Tuesday morning. She excused herself from the table and walked home through the evening heat with her hands balled at her sides and her mind racing through everything she knew, everything she had deliberately not looked at in the ledgers for 3 years, Everything she had told herself was not her business, even as she had filed the columns and balanced the accounts and found once a discrepancy that pointed toward something ugly, and then found it again, corrected, the next morning. As if her father's hand had reached in and smoothed it over before she could ask questions. The land fraud had begun, as she would eventually understand it fully, in 1874. Clarence Yates had been the county land agent since 1871, which put him in a position of enormous power in a region where land was everything. Water rights, grazing rights, homestead claims, all of it passed through his office and bore his signature. A group of investors from San Antonio, men whose names Julia would later learn were Aldous Crane and Price Whitmore, and a third man who went by several names, had approached Clarence Yates with a proposition. They wanted access to certain parcels in the Eastern Valley that were nominally held under homestead claims by several Mexican-American families who had been in the region since before Texas statehood. Families who had Spanish land grants that predated everything that should have been ironclad. Clarence Yates had manipulated the survey records. He had reclassified the Spanish grants as disputed, dragged the families through proceedings they could not afford to fight, and facilitated the transfer of those lands to the San Antonio investors for prices that were a fraction of the actual value. The families had lost everything. At least two of them had left the county entirely. One man, a rancher named Esteban Delgado, had tried to fight the proceedings in court and had died in what was ruled an accidental shooting in the fall of 1875. Julia did not know all of this. She knew some of it, in the way that you sometimes know things that you have refused to look at directly, like knowing there is something in a dark room without lighting the lamp. Alfred Morgan had been brought to Redemption Creek by the United States Department of the Interior's newly formed Land Office Investigations Bureau, which operated with small, discreet teams of men who traveled as civilians and gathered evidence for federal prosecution of land fraud. He was not a lawyer. He was an investigator. He was 31 years old, and he had been doing this work for 4 years, and he had seen the consequences of land fraud in a dozen counties across Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado, and he had never once compromised an investigation for personal reasons. He had not anticipated Julia Yates. He had known she existed before he arrived. He had known she worked in the land office. He had assumed she was complicit, the way family members of corrupt officials usually were, either actively or through willful blindness. He had planned to use her. That was the cold calculation he had made riding into Redemption Creek on a June morning. He would befriend the land agent's daughter, gain access to the records through legitimate requests she would facilitate, and build the case. He had not planned for the way she managed the books with a precision that was almost painful to witness. He had not planned for the quality of her mind, the way she moved through numbers with the ease of someone doing something natural rather than performed. He had not planned for the fact that on the third day, when he had been looking at the 1874 transfer records, she had set a particular ledger in front of him without being asked, a ledger that contained, if you knew what to look for, a documented discrepancy that pointed directly to the fraud. And then she had said, in a voice so carefully neutral it might have been etched in stone, that she thought this one might be relevant to what he was looking for. She had known. Not everything, but enough. And she had shown him. Alfred Morgan had gone back to his room at the boarding house that night and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at his hands for a long time, trying to decide what to do with the fact that the woman he had expected to be an obstacle had just handed him the cornerstone of his case, and that he had feelings about her that had absolutely no business existing in an ongoing federal investigation. He was a methodical man. He had always prided himself on that. He made decisions by reasoning through them, step by careful step, and he did not deviate from rational process under pressure. This was what made him good at his work. He went to supper with her because he told himself it was part of the investigation. He brought her apple pie because he told himself it was how you built rapport with a source. He asked careful questions over roast beef because he told himself he needed to know how much she knew and where her loyalties lay. None of that was the whole truth. In the days after their supper, Julia was cool to him. Professional, precisely correct, helpful with the records in a way that had no warmth in it. She did not ask him to leave. She did not report him to her father. She simply put a glass wall between herself and Alfred Morgan and went about her work behind it. And Alfred could see her thinking, could almost hear the careful, terrible arithmetic she was doing, adding up everything she knew about her father against everything she feared about what Alfred was there to find. He came in on a Thursday afternoon, and she was alone in the office. And instead of going to the map table, he sat down in the chair across from her desk and said, "I owe you honesty." Julia looked up from her ledger. "That's an unusual thing for a man in your position to offer." "I know. What position is that, exactly?" "Federal investigator," Alfred said. "United States Department of the Interior. I am here because we have reason to believe significant land fraud was committed in this county between 1874 and 1876, with your father as the central figure." Julia had gone very still. Outside, a horse cart went by on the dry street, its wheels raising a small cloud of dust that filtered through the window light. "How long have you been planning this conversation?" she said. "Since the day you showed me that ledger," Alfred said. "I have been trying to figure out whether to tell you the truth for approximately 3 weeks. And what decided it?" Alfred looked at her directly. "You did," he said. "The fact that you showed me the ledger at all. You had already made your own decision. You just haven't finished making it yet." Julia looked down at her hands on the desk. They were steady, which surprised her. "If I help you build a case against my father," she said slowly, "what happens to me?" "Nothing," Alfred said. "You have committed no crime. You have actually, whether intentionally or not, already begun assisting a federal investigation by providing those records. You are a witness, not a suspect." "And my father?" Alfred was quiet for a moment. "He will be prosecuted. What the court does with that is not mine to determine." Julia nodded one small, precise nod. "The families," she said. "The Delgado family, the Garcias. The others, what happens to them?" "Part of what I am building toward is a recommendation for restoration of the land claims where possible," Alfred said, "and federal compensation where restoration is not possible. I cannot promise outcomes. I can promise the effort." Julia looked at him for a long time. There was something in her expression that Alfred could not fully read, which was rare for him. It was grief, he thought, and determination, and something else that he was not going to name yet because naming it would make things more complicated than he could afford. "All right," she said. "I will help you." She helped him. Over the next 6 weeks, she provided access to every record in the office, walked him through the filing system, decoded her own meticulous entries, and explained what the gaps meant, and where the alterations had been made and by whose hand. She did this with the same careful precision she brought to everything, and Alfred took notes in a leather-bound notebook and asked questions. And gradually, the full architecture of Clarence Yates' fraud became clear and documented. It was during these weeks that the other thing happened, the thing that neither of them had planned for. They fell into the habit of working late into the evenings, when the office was cool and the town had quieted. Julia would bring a lamp from the back room and set it between them, and they would work across the table from each other. And sometimes they would stop working and simply talk. Alfred told her about Missouri, about growing up on a farm outside Springfield that his family had lost when he was 14, about the particular education that losing a piece of land gives you in terms of understanding what it means and what people will do for it. Julia told him about Robert Cleet, the man she had been engaged to, who had been gentle and kind and had died of typhoid fever before they were married, and about how grief had sharpened her in some ways and made her more cautious in others. "You closed yourself off," Alfred said one evening. "I suppose I did," Julia said. She was studying a map and did not look up. "And then you started noticing things about the ledgers that you found it easier not to see before." She was quiet for a moment. "When you lose someone," she said, You stop being willing to pretend that things are fine when they aren't. It seems like a waste. Alfred watched her face in the lamp light. She had a way of speaking about difficult things as though she were reporting on them, factual and contained, and he had come to understand that this was not coldness but its precise opposite. She felt things so deeply that she had learned to handle them with care, the way you carry something that might shatter. "Julia," he said. He had not used her first name before. She looked up. "I want to tell you something that is not part of this investigation," he said. "And I want you to decide whether you want to hear it or not, because once I say it I cannot unsay it and it will change the way we are working together." "Tell me," she said. "I came here expecting to use you," Alfred said. "I want to be honest about that. I came here believing you were likely complicit, and I plan to use your access to the records and your family connection as tools. I was wrong about your complicity, and I have not used you in the way I planned, but I need you to know that was my original intention." Julia set down the map. She looked at him with those dark eyes, and he could not tell what she was going to say. "I know," she said. "You know. I suspected it from the beginning," she said. "No one asks those particular questions about those particular records just because they are looking to buy land. I knew you were there for a reason. I showed you the ledger deliberately because I had already decided and because I wanted to see what you would do with it, whether you would be honest about why you were here." Alfred stared at her. "You tested me." "Yes," she said, "and then you brought me pie and asked me to supper, and I thought perhaps I had misjudged you. And now," Julia looked at the lamp between them, at the small circle of gold light it made on the table. "I think," she said carefully, "that you are a man who does difficult things for the right reasons and is honest enough to feel bad about the wrong ones, which is more than I can say for most people I know." Alfred said, "I think you are the most remarkable woman I have ever met." Julia looked at him again, and the thing in her expression that he had not wanted to name was right there, unguarded in the lamplight. "That," she said, "is an observation I am going to need some time to know what to do with." He gave her the time. He was good at patience, which is one of the qualities you develop when your work requires waiting for things to fall into place. But the patience was different now. It had a direction and a weight to it that his professional patience never did. Redemption Creek was a small town. A man and a woman working alone together after dark for 6 weeks does not go unnoticed. Mrs. Kavanaugh had opinions, and Hartwell Briggs at the general store had opinions, and the barber had opinions, and most of the opinions were the kind that were spoken in the specific tone of people who are policing a boundary that was never theirs to police. Julia handled the opinions the way she handled most things, with a kind of calm refusal to be managed by them, and Alfred handled them by not being in the saloon often enough for the men who gathered there to find him an easy audience. But Clarence Yates had opinions too, and those were the dangerous ones. Clarence Yates was a man who had built an empire on the management of other people's perceptions of him. He was 61 years old, white-haired, with a dignified bearing and a reputation that was entirely constructed, and he was not stupid. He had watched Alfred Morgan come in and out of his land office for weeks, and he had made inquiries, the way men like him do, through carefully placed letters and strategic conversations, about who Alfred Morgan was. He had not found the truth. Alfred's cover story was good, and his department had built it carefully. But Clarence Yates had not gotten to where he was by ignoring things he could not fully explain. He came to the land office on a Thursday evening when Julia was working late alone, Alfred having gone to his room to compile his notes. He let himself in with his key, which he still had, and he sat down in the chair across from his daughter's desk the way Alfred had sat in it the day he had told her the truth. "I want to know about Alfred Morgan," Clarence said. Julia looked up from the ledger she was working on. She was very good at not showing fear. She had been practicing that skill for 3 years. "He is a prospective land buyer," she said. "He has been looking at parcels in the Eastern Valley." "For 7 weeks," Clarence said. "No one looks at land for 7 weeks. Some people are careful," Julia said. Clarence Yates looked at his daughter for a long moment. He was a man who could read people, which was part of how he had gotten away with so much for so long. "You know something," he said, "about him." "I know he is a thorough man," Julia said. "Julia," her father's voice dropped, became something intimate and dangerous. "I have always trusted you with my business. You are my blood. Whatever this man has told you, whatever he has offered you, you need to understand that your loyalty is to this family." "I understand loyalty," Julia said carefully. "I have given it for a very long time." Clarence stood. He buttoned his coat, a precise, controlled gesture. "I am going to find out who this man is," he said. "And when I do, I expect you to be on the right side of that conversation." He left. Julia sat at her desk until she heard his boots on the stairs outside. Then she put her face in her hands and breathed carefully for about 30 seconds. Then she stood, put on her hat, and walked through the dark to Alfred's room at the boarding house. She knocked. He answered the door with his shirt untucked and his notebook in his hand and a look of surprise that became something else when he saw her face. "Come in," he said. She told him about her father's visit. Alfred listened with perfect stillness, and then he moved to the window and looked down at the street with his arms crossed. "How long do we have?" Julia asked. "Maybe 2 weeks," Alfred said. "He will write to San Antonio. Crane and Whitmore will tell him as much as they know, which should still be nothing, but it will make him nervous enough to start destroying records." He turned from the window. "I need to move the timeline up. There are 3 pieces of documentary evidence I still need, and I was hoping for more time, but we work with what we have." "Tell me what you need," Julia said. "I need the original survey records from 1874, Alfred said. "Not the copies in the public office, the original field notes. I believe your father has them." "In his study," Julia said immediately. "At the house. He keeps a locked strongbox in the bottom drawer of his desk." Alfred was quiet. "You cannot ask me that," Julia said. "No," Alfred said, "I cannot." They looked at each other across the width of the small room, with the kerosene lamp between them throwing gold light and shadow, and the night sounds of Redemption Creek coming through the window, a dog somewhere, the distant piano from the Silver Meridian, a horse shifting in a stable. "I know the combination," Julia said. "He said it himself in 1875. I saw him do it. It is the year of my birth." Alfred did not say anything. "If I do this," Julia said, "I need you to tell me something first, not about the case, about you." "All right," Alfred said. "When this is over," she said, "and you have what you need, what happens then? You leave for the next county, the next case. And I am here, with whatever is left of my father's reputation and my own, and a town that will have watched the daughter testify against her family." Alfred crossed the room and stood in front of her. He was close enough that she could see the precise color of his eyes in the lamplight, and they were not gray the way she had thought. They were gray with something behind them, like the sky before rain. "What happens then," he said, "depends on what you want." "Alfred," she said, and her voice was the most unguarded he had ever heard it, "I'm not asking you for promises you cannot keep. I'm asking you whether this, whatever this is between us, matters to you, or whether I am still a means to an end." He took her hand, which he had never done before. His hand was warm and very steady. "You are the reason I told you the truth," he said. "That is not the behavior of a man who sees you as a means to an end. That is the behavior of a man who had a plan and then met you, and the plan became impossible to follow." Julia looked at their joined hands. "That is not a direct answer," she said. "No," Alfred said, "it is not. You deserve a better one, and I will give it to you when I have earned the right to." He pressed her hand gently and then released it. "Right now, I need you to decide whether you can get me those survey records." Julia Yates stood in Alfred Morgan's room and made the most difficult decision of her 24 years of life. She was choosing between her father, who had given her life and education, and who she knew now to be a criminal who had stolen land from families who had every right to it, and a man she had known for 7 weeks who made her feel like herself in a way she had not felt since before Robert Cleet died, and who had been honest with her even when it would have been easier not to be. She thought about Esteban Delgado, who had died in the fall of 1875 trying to fight for what was his. She thought about the names in the ledger, the Garcias and the Mendozas and the Reyes family, people who had been on that land longer than Texas had been a state. She thought about all the careful not looking she had done for 3 years, and how it had not made her feel safe, only ashamed. "Yes," she said, "I can get them." She went that night. Her father was at the Silver Meridian, where he went every Thursday evening to play cards with the county commissioner and Judge Harlow, which was itself a fact that told you a great deal about the way Redemption Creek operated. Julia let herself into the house she had grown up in and went to her father's study, and opened the strongbox with a combination that was the year of her own birth, and took out the original survey field notes from 1874, and a second set of documents she found beneath them, which were letters between Clarence Yates and Aldous Crane in San Antonio that were more explicit and damning than anything Alfred had found in the public records. She sat at her father's desk for a moment with those documents in her hands. The house was quiet around her. She could smell her father's pipe tobacco, which had permeated the curtains and the furniture, and had been the smell of her entire childhood. She thought about the man who had sung hymns on Sunday mornings in a clear baritone while she sat beside him in the church pew. She thought about how he had sat with her through the fever that had killed Robert Cleet, keeping vigil the way a good father does. She thought about Esteban Delgado again. She put the documents under her arm and walked out of the house. She went back to Alfred's room. He was still awake, still at the table with his notebook, and when he saw what she had brought, he went very still in the way she had come to associate with him, feeling something large that he was not going to perform. He looked through the documents carefully, set the letters from Aldous Crane on the table and read them twice. Then he looked up at Julia, who was standing near the door, and his expression was complicated in a way she had not seen before. "This is everything," he said. "Julia, this is more than I needed. This is the whole case." "There are letters from Crane," she said. "I thought so." "There is also a letter," Alfred said carefully, "from your father to Judge Harlow." He was watching her face. "About the Delgado case." Julia's hands went cold. "What does it say?" "The accidental shooting," Alfred said, "was not accidental." The silence was enormous. "My father," Julia said. Her voice had gone flat and far away, like a sound heard through water. "The letter arranges it," Alfred said. "He did not pull the trigger himself, but he arranged it." Julia sat down in the chair because her knees had made a unilateral decision about that. Alfred moved to her immediately, not touching her but close, the way you stand near someone who might be about to break. She did not break. She sat very straight in the chair and breathed carefully and looked at the floor for about a minute. Then she said, "He has to pay for that." "Yes," Alfred said, "he does. All of it," she said. "The land, the families, the letters, Esteban Delgado, he pays for all of it." "Yes," Alfred said. Julia looked up at him. Her eyes were wet, but nothing had fallen yet. "I want it on record," she said, "that I found these documents and delivered them to you voluntarily. I want it on record that I cooperated fully." "It will be on record," Alfred said. "And I want," she said, and then she stopped because her voice had done something she had not given it permission to do. She pressed her lips together and tried again. "I want those families to get their land back." "I will make that the first recommendation in my report," Alfred said. He crouched down to her level, looking up at her face. "Julia, look at me." She looked at him. "What you did tonight," he said, "was one of the bravest things I have ever seen. I have worked with federal marshals and lawyers and trained investigators, and what you did tonight, going into that house, making that choice, required more courage than most of them have ever shown." "Do not praise me for it," Julia said. "I should have looked at the ledgers properly 3 years ago. I should have looked at what they meant instead of pretending." "You didn't know about Delgado," Alfred said. "And you came forward the moment you had the chance. It is not enough." "No," he said honestly, "it is not entirely enough, but it is what you can do now, and you did it." She looked at him for a long time, this man crouching on the floor of his rented room in a boarding house in Redemption Creek, Texas, with his shirt still untucked and his gray eyes steady on her face, and she felt something shift in her chest like a door opening that she had thought was permanently sealed. "Alfred," she said. "Yes." "I am going to need somewhere to be," she said. "When this is over, I cannot stay in my father's house. I don't know if I can stay in this town." Alfred stood. He held out his hand and she took it and stood too, and they were very close in the small room. "Let me finish this," he said, "and then let us figure that out together." "Together," she repeated, as if testing the word. "Together," Alfred said firmly. He contacted the federal marshal's office in Austin the next morning, sending a coded telegraph that had a cover message about land sales and a real message about evidence secured and federal action requested. He then spent 4 days organizing everything Julia had provided into a comprehensive evidentiary package. Julia came to his room every evening and helped him organize, and they worked together with a focus and a wordless coordination that felt like something they had been doing for years rather than weeks. They were careful in public. Julia was calm and professional at the land office. Alfred continued his fiction of being a land buyer, asking Hartwell Briggs's opinion of the Eastern Valley parcels in a conversation that served no purpose except to maintain his cover story. But Clarence Yates was not a man who moved slowly once he was suspicious. On a Wednesday morning, 11 days after Julia had taken the documents, Clarence Yates walked into the land office while Alfred was there reviewing survey maps, and he set a piece of paper on the table in front of Alfred Morgan and said, very quietly, "I know who you are." Alfred looked at the paper. It was a letter from a private inquiry agency in San Antonio. It did not name his department correctly, but it was close enough. Alfred looked up at Clarence Yates. He was aware that Julia had gone very still at her desk. "Mr. Yates," Alfred said. "You are not a land buyer," Clarence said. "You are a government man, and you have been working my own daughter against me." "I have been conducting a federal investigation," Alfred said. He kept his voice level. There was no point in maintaining the fiction now. "Into land fraud in this county going back to 1874. You have the right to say nothing until federal marshals arrive, which will be within the week." Clarence Yates turned to look at his daughter. That look was the thing Julia would remember longest from that day. It was not anger exactly. Something more personal than anger. It was the look of a man whose construction of himself was collapsing and who needed to find something to blame for the collapse. "You," he said to Julia, "my own blood." "Yes," Julia said. She met his eyes and did not look away. "I found out what you did to Esteban Delgado, what you arranged." Clarence Yates went white. It was striking how quickly the color left his face. "That was," he started. "Do not," Julia said. "Do not explain it to me. Do not tell me it was complicated or necessary. I do not want to hear it." Clarence looked between his daughter and Alfred Morgan. Then he did something that none of them had predicted. He turned and walked out of the land office and did not say another word. Alfred moved immediately. "He is going to run," he said. "Or he is going to do something worse," Julia said. She was already reaching under the desk for the small leather satchel she had prepared at Alfred's direction for exactly this contingency. "What do we do?" Alfred had already made the calculation. "The documents are secure. I need to telegraph Austin immediately and move up the timeline. Can you go to the boarding house and stay with Mrs. Kavanaugh? Do not go home." "Yes," Julia said. "Julia," he caught her hand as she came around the desk. He held it for a moment. "Be careful." "You too," she said. The next 4 hours were the most frightening of Julia's life, which was saying something given the recent history of her life. She sat in Mrs. Kavanaugh's parlor and drank tea she did not taste, and listened to the ordinary sounds of a small town going about its business, while somewhere in it her father was making choices that would determine what was left of both their lives. Alfred had gone to the telegraph office, and then to find the town's deputy marshal, a man named Lem Prout who had no idea what was about to land on his desk. And Alfred had shown him credentials that made Prout go pale, and then nod, and then start asking questions that Alfred answered with the efficient brevity of a man operating on a compressed timeline. Clarence Yates had gone to the Silver Meridian. He had sent a boy to find Judge Harlow, who had arrived at the Silver Meridian within the hour, and the two men had spoken in the back room behind the bar. What they said, Alfred learned later from the bartender who had been close enough to hear through the thin partition wall, was that Clarence Yates had told Harlow that the government had found the Delgado letters. And Harlow had said that Clarence should have burned those letters 4 years ago. And Clarence had said there had not seemed to be any point, since he had Harlow's signature on the judicial rulings, and Harlow had as much to lose as he did. The conversation had apparently deteriorated significantly from there. It was Judge Harlow who had then gone to his courthouse office and retrieved a weapon, and it was Judge Harlow who had walked back into the Silver Meridian in front of witnesses and made a series of accusations at Clarence Yates that were, from the point of view of any man in the room, confusing but clearly escalating. It was at this point that Alfred Morgan had arrived, because Deputy Prout had gotten wind of something happening at the Silver Meridian and had gone there, and Alfred had been with Prout. Alfred walked into the Silver Meridian saloon with a federal credential in one hand and his revolver in the other, and the room had gone silent, and he had positioned himself between Judge Harlow, who was making very poor decisions, and Clarence Yates, who had gone past running and was now simply looking defeated, which was somehow worse. "Judge Harlow," Alfred said clearly into the silence, "by the authority of the United States Department of the Interior, I am placing you under arrest." "Drop the weapon." Harlow looked at Alfred with the expression of a man who has just recognized that every exit has closed. He dropped the weapon. Clarence Yates sat down heavily in a chair and put his face in his hands, and he was still sitting there when Julia arrived because someone had gone to tell her, and she had refused to stay at Mrs. Kavanaugh's any longer. She stood in the doorway of the Silver Meridian saloon and looked at her father, and he looked at her, and there was nothing between them that could be fixed or taken back. "Julia," he said. "No," she said, just that one word. Then she looked at Alfred Morgan, who had his gun in his hand and was watching everything with those steady gray eyes, and something passed between them that everyone in the saloon could feel, though none of them could have named it. It was that same evening, in the Silver Meridian, after the arrests had been made and Prout had his prisoners secured, and the federal marshal from Austin had been sent for and was on his way, that the saloon had settled into a tense quiet, and Alfred had set his gun down on the bar, and Julia had asked him the question that she had been carrying for 3 years without knowing it was his answer she was waiting for. "Did you know?" And Alfred had said, "Some questions take a long time to deserve an answer." And then he answered everyone. He told her that, yes, he had known who she was before he walked through the door of the land office. He had known she was Clarence Yates' daughter and that she worked in the office and had access to the records. He had planned to use that access. He told her that he had not known, not until the 3rd day and the ledger she showed him, that she was already aware something was wrong. He had not known she was the kind of woman she was. He told her that by the time he asked her to supper, the plan had changed. He had not admitted that to himself clearly yet, but it had changed. He was already telling himself stories about working relationships and professional necessity, but underneath those stories was the truth, which was that he had wanted to sit across a table from her in the ordinary human way of a person who wants to be near someone. He told her that the night she had come to his room and told him about her father's warning visit, and he had seen her face in the dark of the hallway. He had understood that he was in love with her, and that this was a problem of significant proportions given his professional circumstances, and that he had dealt with this understanding by focusing intensely on the work for about 2 weeks. He told her that what happened then, when this was over, was not a thing he was willing to leave to circumstance. He was not going to ride out of Redemption Creek and onto the next county and let Julia Yates become a case file and a memory. He was going to see this through, the investigation, the prosecution, the federal proceedings, and when it was done, he was going to ask her something, a direct question that also required a direct answer, and he would like to know now if that question would have a chance. Julia Yates stood at the bar of the Silver Meridian Saloon in Redemption Creek, Texas, in the summer of 1878, and listened to Alfred Morgan answer every question she had asked and several she had not, and when he was done she was quiet for a long moment. "You are very thorough," she said. "It is a professional habit," Alfred said. "The question you are planning to ask me," she said. "What is it?" "Julia." "Alfred." He looked at her steadily. "Will you marry me?" he said. "When this is over, will you marry me?" The kerosene lamp swayed. Outside, a horse shifted. The bartender pretended to be wiping glasses in the far corner and was doing an exceptionally poor job of pretending. "I am 24 years old," Julia said, "and I have just helped send my father to federal prison, and my entire life in this town is going to be unrecognizable by next month." "Yes," Alfred said, "and you are asking me to marry you in a saloon," she said. "I understand it is not ideal," Alfred said. "The timing and the location could both be improved. If you would like me to wait and ask again in better circumstances, I will wait." Julia looked at him for a long time. She looked at the steadiness of him, the honesty he had shown her even when it would have been easier not to, the way he had crouched on the floor of his rented room to look up at her face when she was breaking, the way he had held her hand when she came back from her father's house with documents that had cost her everything she thought she knew. "No," she said, "I do not want you to wait." "Is that a yes?" Alfred said. "Yes," Julia said, "that is a yes." The bartender coughed. Alfred and Julia both looked at him. He held up both hands with an expression of pure innocence and went back to his glass. The federal marshal from Austin arrived 3 days later. His name was Yancey Webb, and he was a large, efficient man with a long mustache and an organized mind, and he read Alfred's documentation package with the focused attention of someone who knew exactly what he was looking at. "This is solid work," Webb said, at the end of a 4-hour review session conducted in the deputy marshal's office. "The letters alone, the original survey notes, the corroborated discrepancies in the ledger, this will prosecute." "I want it on record," Alfred said, "that Miss Julia Yates provided the documentary evidence and cooperated fully with the investigation." Webb looked at him over the documentation. He had the particular look of a man who has been in the field long enough to recognize when a colleague has gotten personally involved. "Noted," Webb said. "And the land restoration recommendations," Alfred said. "I want those in the report." "Also noted," Webb said. "Morgan," he paused. "How long did this investigation take?" 8 weeks, Alfred said. "You did in 8 weeks what we expected to take 6 months, Webb said. "I'm not going to ask too many questions about methodology." "That would be appreciated," Alfred said. "The trial of Clarence Yates and Judge Harlow was conducted in federal court in Austin in October of 1878. Alfred testified for 4 days. Julia testified for 2. She sat in the witness box with her hands folded in her lap and answered every question put to her with precision and completeness, including questions about the ledger discrepancies and including questions about how she had obtained the documents from the strongbox. She did not look at her father while she testified. She had made that decision before she walked into the courtroom, and she held to it. Clarence Yates was convicted on 8 counts of land fraud and 1 count of conspiracy in the death of Esteban Delgado. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Judge Harlow was convicted on 6 counts and sentenced to 9 years. The San Antonio investors, Aldous Crane and Price Whitmore, were named in the indictment and were the subject of a separate federal action that Alfred was not part of but that resulted, he heard later, in significant convictions. The land restoration process took time, as these things do, but it moved. The Federal Land Office began proceedings in November of 1878 to restore the Spanish grant parcels to the families from whom they had been taken. The Garcia family, who had moved to San Antonio, received formal notification in January of 1879. The Mendoza family received their restoration in February. The Reyes family's claim was more complicated, but was resolved by May. The family of Esteban Delgado received a formal statement from the federal government acknowledging the conspiracy in his death. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. But his widow, A woman named Rosaria Delgado, who had remarried and was living in Laredo, received the statement and the land restoration that went with it, and she wrote a letter to the Department of the Interior that Alfred read and kept. Julia Yates and Alfred Morgan were married on the 15th of November, 1878, in Austin, Texas, in a small ceremony attended by Marshal Webb, who stood as a witness with his hat under his arm and his mustache at its most dignified, and by a woman named Clara Brixton, who had been Julia's friend since childhood and who had traveled from Redemption Creek in a stage that had taken 2 days and arrived with 3 broken springs, and who cried through the entire ceremony with the complete commitment of someone who has been waiting for this event for longer than the principals themselves. The ceremony was performed by a minister named Reverend Aldrich, who had a kind face and a brief and sensible approach to weddings, which Julia appreciated. Alfred stood at the front of the church with his hat in his hand, the same gesture Julia had noticed on the very first day she saw him, and when she walked toward him down the aisle of the small Austin church on Clara Brixton's arm, because her father was in a federal prison and she had no one else to walk her. Alfred looked at her with an expression that she did not have a word for and did not need one. They said their vows. Alfred's hands were, for the first time Julia had ever observed, not entirely steady. She said this to him quietly afterward outside the church, while Clara Brixton was enthusiastically describing the wedding to Marshal Webb, who was being very patient about it. "Your hands," she said, "they shook." Alfred looked at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. "So they did," he said. "You are always so steady," Julia said. "Every time, guns, courtrooms, difficult conversations, steady." "This was different," Alfred said. "How?" He looked at her in her good blue dress, in the November light outside the Austin church. "Because it mattered more than anything I have done," he said. "And there was no amount of professional preparation that would have changed that." Julia took his still not entirely steady hands in hers and held them. "Alfred Morgan," she said, "you were right about questions taking a long time to deserve an answer." "Was I?" "Yes," she said. "I have been asking myself some questions for 3 years, about what I was doing, about the ledgers, about what kind of woman I was going to be, and I think I needed all of that time and all of what happened to deserve the answers." Alfred considered this. "What are the answers?" "That I am the kind of woman who will do the hard thing," Julia said, "even when it costs everything, and that I want to do it with someone beside me who is the same." He brought her hands up and pressed them briefly to his lips, and Julia Yates, who had always handled her feelings with great care because she knew how easily things could shatter, let herself be happy. They settled in Austin initially, because Alfred's work kept him there through the winter, and Julia found work as a bookkeeper for a law firm that was more than grateful for her meticulous skills and did not ask too many questions about why a young woman was so extremely accomplished with evidence. She was good at her work and she liked it, and Austin in the winter of 1878 was a better place to be than Redemption Creek with its complicated memories. They lived in rooms above a dry goods store on 6th Street, 2 connected rooms with windows that looked out onto the street and let in the cold winter light, and a stove that worked reliably, and a narrow staircase that creaked reliably, and it was the first home Julia had made that was entirely her own, and she found this astonishing and magnificent. Alfred was home most evenings by 6, and they ate supper together at the small table by the window, and it was ordinary in the way that only things you have very much wanted can be ordinary, suffused with a specific warmth that Julia, in her more private moments, thought of as the warmth of a life that was genuinely hers. He told her more about Missouri, about the farm, about the years after losing the land when his family had scattered, and he had been 14 and too old to be a child and too young to know what to do with his anger, and how he had eventually channeled it into the painstaking, careful work of federal investigation, which was a roundabout way of protecting the thing he had lost. She told him more about Robert Cleet, about what it had been like to grieve someone young, and Alfred listened the way he always listened, with his complete attention, and he never said anything dismissive about it or tried to minimize it. He understood that grief was a fact, not a competition. She told him about the 3 years of not looking at the ledgers properly. "I have to live with that," she said. "The Delgados and the others, those years when I could have done something and I chose not to see." "Yes," Alfred said. He did not tell her it was not her fault. He understood that would have been condescending and incorrect. "You live with it and you did something when it mattered." "It should have mattered sooner," Julia said. "Yes," Alfred said again. "That is true." He looked at her. "Regret is useful when it changes what you do next. After that it is just wait." "You have things you regret," Julia said. It was not a question. "Yes," Alfred said. "The plan I had when I rode into Redemption Creek. Using your access and your family connection before I knew who you were, I could have approached that differently." "You could not have known," Julia said. "No, but I could have found out faster," Alfred said. "I could have given you the truth sooner." "You gave it to me when you had enough trust in me to risk it," Julia said. "That is not the worst timeline." He looked at her with those gray eyes, and something in his expression was quiet and full. "You are very fair-minded," he said. "I am trying to be," Julia said. "It requires practice." In the spring of 1879, Alfred was assigned to a land fraud case in New Mexico Territory, in the area around Santa Fe, which was a different kind of place entirely. High desert and old adobe, and a complicated history of Spanish, Mexican, and Anglo law all tangled together in ways that required careful navigation. He asked Julia if she wanted to come, which she did, and they packed their 2 rooms into a trunk and several bags and took the stage west. Santa Fe was a revelation to Julia. The landscape was nothing like Texas, the enormous sky, the ochre and red of the earth, the way the mountains sat at the edge of everything like a permanent reminder that some things did not move. She walked through the old plaza on their first evening and felt something expand in her chest that she had not known was contracted. Alfred's work in New Mexico was slower and more complex than Redemption Creek, and he was often occupied during the day with meetings and record reviews, and the particular laborious process of untangling land grant law that was in 4 languages and 3 legal traditions. Julia found work with a merchant in the plaza who needed his accounts organized, and she organized them so thoroughly and so well that within a month he was asking if she knew anyone else with her skills. And within 3 months she had 3 clients and a growing reputation as the most reliable bookkeeper in the territory. She was 25 years old and running her own small practice in Santa Fe, New Mexico Territory, and she thought about the version of herself who had sat at a desk in her father's land office in Redemption Creek and deliberately not looked at things, and the distance between those 2 versions felt like a measurement of who she had chosen to become. Alfred was good at his work. She had known this in the abstract, but watching him navigate the Santa Fe case gave her a specific and detailed appreciation of it. He was patient in ways that most people were not capable of sustaining, willing to spend 3 weeks on a single thread of evidence because he knew where it led. He was careful with people, particularly with the Pueblo community members and the old Mexican-American landholding families who had reasons not to trust government men, and needed to know that this particular government man was different. He was honest with them in the way he had been honest with Julia, directly and without softening things that should not be softened. She watched him sit across a kitchen table from an elderly woman named Doña Esperanza Vargas, who was 81 years old and had land documents going back to 1803, and she watched him look at those documents with complete and genuine respect, and ask questions in the careful formal Spanish he had apparently taught himself on the road west. And she thought, with a clarity that was almost physical, that this was the person she had chosen, and that she would make this choice every single day. Alfred wrapped the Santa Fe case in late 1879 and filed his recommendations in January of 1880. The outcomes for that case were mixed, as land cases often were. complicated by the politics of the territory and the difficulty of applying federal statute in a region where the legal history went back 3 centuries. But several families had their claims restored, and others received formal recognition of title that had been disputed. And the federal report included specific language that Alfred had insisted on about the history of dispossession and the obligation of the federal government to make things right where it still could. Marshal Webb, who had been promoted and was now running the Land Office Investigations Bureau from Washington, sent a letter that commended the report and noted that its language was more political than was typical for the Bureau. And Alfred wrote back that he considered it accurate rather than political, and Webb wrote back that in Washington those were sometimes the same thing. They were in Santa Fe when Julia discovered she was expecting a child. She had suspected for about 3 weeks and confirmed it as certainly as a woman could confirm such a thing in 1880, and she sat with the knowledge for 2 days before she told Alfred, not from fear of his reaction, but from the private need to hold it for herself first, the way she held all important things initially, turning them over in her mind before she let them out into the world. She told him on a Sunday morning in February, when the desert light was coming through the window at a low angle and making everything look ancient and golden. Alfred was sitting at the table with his coffee and the week's accumulated notes, and she sat down across from him and said, without preamble, "I believe we are going to have a child." Alfred looked up from his notes. His expression went through several things very quickly. Then it arrived at something that Julia recognized as a kind of overwhelmed joy, the kind that does not know what to do with itself immediately. He set down his coffee. "When?" he said. "September," she said. "I think." He looked at her for a moment, and then he stood up and came around the table and held her the way he held her when things were large, solidly, and without making a performance of it. And she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the warmth of it and the realness of it and let herself be glad. "Are you frightened?" he said. "Yes," she said honestly. "Some." "Good," Alfred said. "That means you are paying attention." She laughed, which she had not expected, and felt the laughter move through her chest like water through dry ground. They started planning. Alfred was due for a posting review in the spring, and had the option of taking a fixed assignment in Austin rather than continuing field work, which he had not previously wanted but which now had clear advantages. Julia was in favor of Austin, which was familiar and had good medical access, and was a place they already knew, but she told him clearly that she would support whatever he decided and meant it. Alfred took the Austin assignment. They returned to Austin in March of 1880 and rented a proper house this time, with a front garden and 3 rooms and a kitchen that had a real iron stove and a back porch that looked out over a neighbor's peach orchard. Julia's bookkeeping practice traveled with her. She wrote letters to her Santa Fe clients and set up appointments with new ones in Austin, and was working within 2 weeks of their arrival, which Alfred watched with a mix of admiration and mild concern about whether she was resting enough. She was resting enough. She was also planting things in the front garden and corresponding with Clara Brixton, who had married a farmer outside Redemption Creek and had 2 children, and was full of advice delivered with great enthusiasm and complete disregard for whether it had been requested. Alfred's fixed assignment in Austin involved working with the Texas Land Office to establish clearer protocols for detecting fraud in ongoing land transactions, which was the kind of unglamorous procedural work that had enormous long-term impact and that Alfred was genuinely good at. He also lectured occasionally at the new law school, talking to young attorneys about evidence and land law, and the particular legal legacy of Spanish and Mexican land grants in Texas and the Southwest, which he believed future lawyers needed to understand if they were going to do their jobs well. Julia came to one of those lectures on an evening in May when she was visibly expecting and sat in the back of the room and watched Alfred stand at the front and talk about the Delgado case and the principles it illustrated without naming anyone. and she watched the young attorneys in the room lean forward without realizing they were doing it, drawn by the particular quality of attention that Alfred paid to things, and that he transmitted when he spoke about them. Afterward, walking home through the Austin evening, he asked her what she had thought. "You were very good," she said. "I mean the material," he said. "Was it clear?" "Perfectly clear," she said. "And you made them care about it, which is harder." "They should care about it," Alfred said. "These are things that happen to real people." "Not everyone sees it that way," Julia said. "Then I suppose they need the lecture more than others," Alfred said. Their son was born on the 14th of September, 1880, on a warm evening with a slight breeze coming through the window. The doctor who attended was a young woman named Dr. Helen Marsh, who had graduated from the Female Medical College of Pennsylvania and had set up practice in Austin the previous year, which had raised some eyebrows, and which Julia considered one of the finest things about her new city. Dr. Marsh was competent and calm, and talked Julia through everything with the steady, pragmatic honesty that Julia particularly appreciated. Alfred waited in the front room with his hands clasped between his knees, which was the closest she ever saw him come to agitation that he could not contain. He wore a line in the parlor floor between the window and the fireplace that she would notice for months afterward. When Dr. Marsh called him in and he walked through the bedroom door and saw Julia sitting up against the pillows with the baby in her arms, he stopped walking as if someone had removed the bones from his legs. "Come here," Julia said. He came. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the small, red-faced, astonishing creature in her arms, and his expression was naked in a way she had never seen before, without any of the careful management that he brought to his face in the world. Just open, just full. "A boy," he said, somewhat unnecessarily, since Dr. Marsh had already told him through the door. "A boy," Julia confirmed. "We need to decide on a name." They had discussed names without settling anything, which in retrospect Julia recognized as the kind of thing two organized people do when they are not ready to make a decision feel real. Now the decision was extremely real and approximately 7 pounds. "Daniel," Alfred said. Julia looked at him. "Where does Daniel come from?" "My grandfather," Alfred said. "He was the one who taught me to read, in Missouri." "Daniel Morgan," Julia said, testing it. "Daniel Alfred Morgan." "If you approve of Alfred in the middle," Alfred said. "I approve of Alfred in general," Julia said. She handed the baby to his father, and Alfred took him with enormous care, supporting the small head the way Dr. Marsh had shown him, and he looked at his son in the September evening light, and Julia watched his face and thought that this was what the whole long, complicated road had been leading to. Not the destination exactly, because this was also a beginning, but the point at which you could look back and see that the road made sense. She visited her father once, in the federal prison in Huntsville. It was in the spring of 1881, when Daniel was 6 months old and had Alfred's gray eyes and Julia's stubborn disposition, which Alfred found hilarious and Julia found both gratifying and alarming. She had not told Alfred she was going until the night before. He had been quiet when she told him, and then had said that he would come with her if she wanted him to, or wait for her, or not discuss it at all, whichever she preferred. She had gone alone. Clarence Yates was smaller than she remembered. Prison had done something to the size of him, not his height but the way he occupied space. The authority and careful presentation that had always attended him was gone, and what was left was an old man in rough clothes with white hair that needed cutting. He had looked at her across the visiting table for a long time without speaking. "Julia," he said finally. "Hello, father," she said. "You have a child," he said. He had heard through whatever channel news traveled in a place like that. "A boy," she said. "Daniel," Clarence nodded. He looked at his hands on the table. "I am not here to forgive you," Julia said. She had decided that before she came, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. "I am here because I needed to see you, and I needed you to see me, and I needed to say one thing." Clarence looked up. "I am all right," Julia said. "I want you to know that. Not because I think you deserve to know it, but because I am not going to let what you did make my life small. I am all right and my son is healthy and I am choosing to live well. That is mine. You do not get to take it." Clarence Yates looked at his daughter for a long moment. In his eyes she thought she saw something that might have been grief, or might have been the particular shame of a man who has finally been stripped of all the explanations he told himself. "I am glad," he said quietly. "For that, at least." Julia stood. "I will not come back," she said. She walked out of the prison into the Texas spring and got into the rented carriage and drove back toward Austin. And somewhere on the road she cried, hard and completely, in a way she had not let herself do since the night in the Silver Meridian. She cried for the father she had thought she had, and for the man he actually was, and for Robert Cleet, and for 3 years of not looking at things she should have looked at, and for Esteban Delgado, and for all the things you carry that you do not get to put down, only learn to carry differently. Then she dried her face and drove the rest of the way home. Alfred was in the front garden when she got back, holding Daniel in the particular efficient manner he had developed for keeping a 6-month-old both contained and interested, which involved a lot of pointing at things and describing them in a tone that suggested everything from peach blossoms to passing horses was of the utmost significance. Daniel, who was already an opinion-having individual, appeared to agree. Alfred looked up when she came through the garden gate. He read her face immediately, the way he always did. He did not say anything. He held out the arm that wasn't occupied with Daniel, and Julia walked into it and stood there in the spring garden with her husband and her son, and the smell of the peach orchard from next door, and let the warmth of it close around her like something she had built for herself, which was exactly what it was. The years that followed were full in the way that good lives are, not easy always, but full. Alfred continued his work for the Land Office Investigations Bureau and eventually rose to lead the Texas division from Austin, which meant less time in the field and more time writing the protocols and training the investigators who went out, and he found, somewhat to his surprise, that this suited him. He was good at teaching people what he knew. He was patient with it and demanding in the right ways. Julia's bookkeeping practice grew steadily until she employed 2 assistants and had more clients than she could manage alone, primarily merchants and law firms, and several of the new women-owned businesses that were beginning to appear in Austin in the 1880s, which she actively sought out because she understood what it meant to be capable and not taken seriously. She was taken seriously now, universally and without question, and she did not forget what it had been like not to be. Daniel grew up with a father who pointed at things and described them as significant, and a mother who kept the most precise accounts of anything in a 5-county radius, which meant he became a boy who paid attention to details and thought that was the most important skill a person could develop, which it might be. They had a daughter in 1883, a fierce and observant girl they named Catherine, after Alfred's mother, who had managed the Missouri farm with more competence than anyone in the county ever acknowledged. Catherine had Julia's dark hair and her own entirely original personality from approximately day one, and Alfred watched her with the same expression he had when he was working out a difficult piece of evidence, fascinated and respectful, and not entirely sure what was going to happen next. Clara Brixton came to visit from Redemption Creek in the summer of 1884, bringing her husband James and their 3 children, and enough opinions to fill the house for a week. She and Julia sat on the back porch in the evenings while the children played in the garden, and the husbands talked farming and investigation in a combination that probably made no logical sense to either of them but seemed to work. And Clara said, at one point, holding her glass of lemonade and looking at Julia in the evening light, "You know, I always knew it." "Knew what?" Julia said. "That you were going to be exactly this," Clara said, gesturing vaguely at the house and the garden and the general existence Julia had assembled. "You just needed the right set of circumstances to stop being so careful with yourself." Julia considered this. "I still get things wrong," she said. "Everyone does," Clara said. "The question is whether you learn." The Garcia family, whose land in Redemption Creek had been restored by the federal proceedings, sent a letter in 1882 addressed to Julia Morgan in Austin. It was from Isabella Garcia, the youngest of the original family's children, who would have been about Julia's age. She had written to say that the family had returned to the land and were running cattle, and that the restoration had made everything possible. She had written to say she knew about Julia's role in the investigation, that she had heard from people in the county, and that she was not sure if gratitude was the right word or whether it was something more complicated than that, but that she had wanted to write. Julia wrote back. She was honest in her reply, the way Alfred had taught her to be, and the way she had slowly taught herself to be over the years. She said that she had not done enough soon enough and that she knew that. She said she hoped the land was everything it should have been for them. She said she was glad they were home. Isabella Garcia wrote back again. They corresponded for several years, a careful, respectful correspondence between two women who had been on different sides of the same terrible thing and were choosing to build something from what remained. Alfred read those letters sometimes, when Julia left them on the table. He never commented on them unless she asked. He understood what they were. In 1886, Alfred was offered a position in Washington with the Central Bureau Office, working at the national level on land policy recommendations. It was a significant opportunity. He came home and sat down with Julia and laid it out completely, all the advantages and all the costs, what it would mean for her practice, for the children's schooling, for the life they had built in Austin. Julia listened to all of it. Then she said, "Do you want it?" Alfred thought about this honestly, the way he thought about all difficult things. "I want the impact it could have," he said. "The policy work, the ability to affect how these cases are handled across the whole country, not just Texas." He paused. "The office itself, the politics of Washington, I want that less." "Could you do the policy work from here?" Julia said. Alfred was quiet for a moment. "There are people in Washington who would not consider it seriously," he said. "There are also people everywhere who did not consider a woman running a bookkeeping practice seriously," Julia said, "and now they come to me for quarterly reviews." Alfred almost smiled. "Are you suggesting I make myself indispensable from Austin?" "I am suggesting," Julia said, "that you already have, and that if Washington wants your mind on their policy problems, they can send papers on the stage like everyone else." Alfred looked at her across the kitchen table, this woman he had married in a small Austin church 8 years ago, who had given him a son and a daughter and a home, and a particular quality of honest companionship he had not known existed before he found it. And he thought that she was still, as she had been in the first weeks in Redemption Creek, the most remarkable person he had met. He declined the Washington position. He wrote to the Bureau that he would be glad to consult on national policy matters by correspondence, and sent with that letter a 60-page analysis of land grant law across the Southwest that he had been developing for 3 years, which the Bureau promptly used as the basis for new federal guidelines that took effect in 1887. He told Julia about this when the confirmation letter arrived. She read the letter and handed it back to him and said, "Did you ever doubt it would work?" "Yes," Alfred said honestly, "some." "Good," Julia said. "That means you were paying attention." He laughed, which she had given him back to himself along with everything else. Daniel Morgan, at 9 years old, was the kind of child who wanted to know why things worked the way they did. He asked his father how investigations worked, and his father told him, in age-appropriate detail, about evidence and documentation, and the importance of not deciding you knew the answer before you had looked at everything. He asked his mother how the numbers in the account books always balanced, and his mother told him that they balanced because you made them balance, which required honesty about every line. "What if someone puts a wrong number in?" Daniel asked. "You find it," Julia said. "How?" "You look carefully," she said. "And you do not look away from things just because they are uncomfortable." Daniel thought about this with the seriousness he brought to most things. "Were you ever uncomfortable with something in a book?" he asked. Julia met Alfred's eyes across the room. Alfred's expression was quiet and fond. "Yes," Julia said. "I was for a long time." "What did you do?" "Eventually," Julia said, "I told the truth about it." Daniel accepted this with the equanimity of a child who has been raised in a household where honesty was the constant operating principle, and had therefore never experienced it as a radical act. Catherine, at 3 years old, was primarily interested in the chickens they had acquired for the back garden, and in the mechanics of the lemonade press, and in her brother, who she followed everywhere with the implacable dedication of a small person who has identified her primary source of information about the world. She called Alfred Papa and Julia Mama, and had a way of appearing in doorways at significant moments, as if she had a sense for when the adults were having important conversations, which made those conversations slightly surreal. She appeared in the kitchen doorway now, with a very small chicken under one arm, regarding her parents and her brother with the composed observation of someone taking notes. "She has your eyes," Alfred said to Julia, not for the first time. "She has her own eyes," Julia said. "That is the whole point." He looked at his wife and thought about everything that had arrived at this kitchen on this afternoon. The document evidence in a locked strongbox, a ledger shown deliberately across a desk, apple pie wrapped in a cloth napkin, the question asked in a saloon when a gun was already in his hand, the answer that had taken a long time to be deserved. "Julia," he said. She looked up from whatever she was making, and her expression was the one he knew best of all her expressions, present and attentive and a little amused, the expression of a woman who is exactly where she has chosen to be. "What?" she said. "Nothing," Alfred said. "I was just going to tell you something." "Then tell me." He crossed the kitchen and kissed her, unhurriedly, in the ordinary middle of a Tuesday afternoon, with their son watching with resigned tolerance and their daughter still holding the chicken, and the Austin light coming through the window the way good light does in a house where people have been genuinely happy for a long time. "I love you," Alfred said. "I wanted to say it in a kitchen specifically. I have been meaning to say it in a kitchen for some time." Julia looked at him with those dark eyes that still occasionally surprised him with what they contained. "Alfred Morgan," she said, "I have been waiting for you to say things in kitchens since approximately 1878. "Then I am glad the timeline is corrected," he said. Outside, the peach orchard from next door was doing something fragrant and optimistic in the afternoon warmth, and the horses on the street were going about their business, and Austin was growing around their house the way cities do in places where people have decided to build something worth having, and Julia Yates, who was Julia Morgan now and had been for 8 years, and who had learned that the hardest questions and the best answers both require you to look at things directly and tell the truth about what you see, put her arms around her husband in the kitchen and held on. Some questions take a long time to deserve an answer. She had learned that this was true. She had also learned that the answer, when it comes, when you have done the hard work of becoming the person who can receive it, is more than you knew to ask for. The afternoon light held. The children were both watching now with varying degrees of interest and amusement. Catherine had apparently made peace with the chicken, who seemed resigned to the situation. Daniel had an expression that was Alfred's expression, considering and fond. Julia looked at her family in the kitchen light and thought that this was what you built when you finally stopped looking away from things. Not perfection, not the absence of difficult things, but something real and chosen and entirely yours, built on the bedrock of the truth you eventually had the courage to tell. She held on to Alfred Morgan and he held on to her. And outside the peach trees did something fragrant, and the horses went about their work, and the world continued on in all its complicated, ordinary magnificence. And they were very much, deeply, completely, unambiguously in love, which is where this story ends and where everything else begins.